Hello, I'm Miriam Cates. You're watching GB News Originals, and I'm joined by a fantastic guest today, Joe Shalam, who is the Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice. And he's here to speak to me about the alarming rise in school absence and what it means for the future, not just of our young people, but for our whole country. Joe, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, school absence has been a focus of the CSJ for some time now. In fact, since COVID. Can you tell me a bit about what's happened? What are the different types of absence that we're seeing, and what is the trend that we're experiencing?
Absolutely. So we came across this issue fairly early on, actually. We're one of the early kind of organisations to spot it. And that was really down to a number of small charities we work with across the country, sort of um, telling us about the early warning signs of this just after the first lockdown, where they said, we're worried that the kids who are experiencing all this disruption to their education are actually less likely to go back. And sadly, we've seen that play out over the last few years. So today we've got a record number of pupils who are severely absent. That means they're missing more than half of all of their school time. And we've got 40% higher rates of persistent absence. So that's pupils missing 1 in every 10 school days. So we've got to do a lot more to get a handle on this crisis, even 5 years on now from the pandemic.
I remember when schools did first go back to full-time face-to-face education, it took some parents, particularly, quite a lot of persuasion to believe that that was safe. And so it was expected that it would take a while for normal absence patterns to return. But nevertheless, the expectation was that it would return to normal. No, it absolutely hasn't. Why is that? What are the reasons that children are just taking so much more time off school?
So I think a lot of us hope that this would kind of be a bit of a post-pandemic quirk. And the danger now, I think the real risk now is that this is becoming a lot more entrenched. And a big part of that is about parental attitude. So we've been polling parents here at the CSJ for some time on this now, and we found that around 3 in 10 parents say that they no longer think that it is essential for their child to attend school every day. Indeed, we're seeing worrying numbers of parents saying that it's reasonable for people to miss 1 in every 10 school days, where all the evidence shows that not only is this having an impact on your grades, unsurprisingly, but you're also much more likely to never go into work after leaving school. For even those who do go into work, you're about 10 grand worse off by age 28. So there is this peculiar change around parental attitudes, and we've got to start focusing a lot more on shifting the attitudes back to that pre-pandemic norm.
How much has the change in attitudes been to do with the schools themselves? Of course, teaching unions particularly, received a lot of criticism, rightly in my view, for being so keen to shut schools down, so unwilling to get teachers back to face-to-face education. Then, of course, all the demands that students should wear masks, social distancing, all those kind of things, which actually are really difficult to remember now because of the suffering that our young people went through. But do you think that I've heard some commentators say that that kind of broke the contract between school and home, and that parents haven't really recovered their expectations that teachers want to teach their children?
Yeah, this is coming through massively when we're talking to parents and teachers, actually, that there's a kind of mutual breakdown in the relationship between homes and classrooms. Parents are saying that they don't feel particularly engaged by what teachers are doing. They don't really know who to turn to if they are, lest we forget, often, if you've got a severely absent pupil, you might have a child with a mental health condition or a neurodivergence, or they're basically refusing to come out of their bedroom. A lot of parents say, we just don't know who to turn to. There isn't the support there from schools. But equally, we know that a lot of teachers are saying we're getting all sorts of abuse from parents, and for kids that are behaving badly in the classroom, many teachers now are reporting that they're being subject to sort of violence at school. They're equally not feeling like the sort of reciprocal relationship is there with parents. So we've got to look at this through sort of both ends of the telescope, I think.
And how do the figures differ in the different age groups? Are absence levels much higher in primary age children, or is this predominantly something that's happening in secondary schools with adolescents? Because obviously as a parent, it's a very different prospect, forcing an 8-year-old who doesn't want to go to school into their uniform and literally carrying them into the classroom if you have to. If you're a single mum and you've got a 15-year-old boy who's refusing to go to school, there's not a lot you can do.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we see this in the data where as pupils get older, we're seeing the absence issue increasing at particularly the secondary school age. And I think what we've tried to do increasingly at the CSJ is look at this outside of the sort of the pandemic discussion, the lockdown discussion, because there was some signs of this issue increasing before COVID. And I think what we've increasingly found is that there are serious questions to ask about whether school is doing enough to engage young people, show them the connection between going to school and moving on and succeeding in life through, a good job, stable income, and setting them up for success. The school reforms over the last 10, 15 years or so have been very good on standards, but I think where we're missing things still now, particularly in the state sector, are on all the wider things and the benefits that school can bring. You look at sport in the independent school sector, for example, it has a huge emphasis on games, on extracurricular activities that provide that rounded experience that teach resilience and discipline and even turning up to work on time, all the skills that set you up for life. And we just don't see that in the state sector as much. So I think that's another big part of how we encourage and incentivize young people to see school as worth turning up to.
I think that's a really good point. And I don't know if you saw, there was a poll out last weekend commissioned by the Adam Smith Institute that showed just 16% of young adults thought that the British education system was setting them up well for adult life. Just 16%, which means that 84% potentially of young people in our schools are thinking, well, this isn't really worth it. What am I going to get out of this? And then, of course, you can perfectly see why they might not be motivated to attend every day.
Yeah, I mean, the danger now, I think, is that the absence crisis goes from a sort of educational issue to actually threatening the future of our economy. We've essentially got a conveyor belt of absent pupils going straight from school into long-term worklessness, inactivity. That's not only a kind of crater in the labour force, but actually costing huge amounts of money in the benefit bill as well, to say nothing of the individual tragedy of people sort of leaving school and ending up at home and not working. So this does have economic implications as well as those grade implications, and it's yet more reason why we need to take this problem very seriously.
Absolutely, because the problem that we have now, and we've seen the more figures out today about how uh, since this government came into power, far fewer people have been sanctioned through the benefit system for not fulfilling their particular criteria, whether that's to look for work or whatever it is. And do you think we are now teaching young people a message that actually you can opt out? You can opt out from society, you can opt out from work, and the taxpayer will fund your lifestyle.
I mean, it's been really striking to me to see the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, making precisely that point over the last week or so. And I think we are seeing that reflected in the data. I mean, picture this: we have 1 million young people now not in education, employment, or training. That is such an untapped resource. If we think about all the economic challenges that we're facing as a country and the tax burden going ever up to sort of pay for this status quo, we need to do a lot more through the benefit system, as well as helping employers as well to incentivize them to take on more British youngsters in a world where, frankly, I think we've also become very reliant on flows of low-skilled migration into a lot of the roles that historically lower qualified youngsters would have gone and done. So we need to look at this absolutely in the round.
Mm. Now, one of the links between school absence and more young people being NEETs, not in education, employment or training, is this mental health crisis, as it's being called. And the million-dollar question is, has there been a genuine increase in mental ill health, or has the change in our culture around mental health, making it much more acceptable to talk about anxiety, depression, destigmatizing the idea of being mentally ill, has that caused people to claim that they can't attend school or work when actually they could? Which is the truth?
I mean, as ever, Miriam, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, we've been struck and sort of banging the drum on this for a long time. That the biggest sort of forgotten factor in the mental health crisis has been family, and the breakdown of stable family homes over the last 50 years. We see this reflected in the data for young people going to CAM services. In a survey published a few years ago, showed young people going to child and adolescent mental health services said that it was relationship problems and family problems that was the main reason why. I think since then, it's fair to say we've seen a huge spike in mental health conditions connected to screen use, to some of the more pernicious effects of social media. So there are some very real material drivers here at play, undoubtedly. At the same time, I think for all the benefits that have come with talking more openly about mental health, there has been a certain amount of diagnostic creep, and the medicalized types of mental health have blurred quite seamlessly with mental well-being and some of the basic kind of ups and downs of normal life. So it's really important that we're speaking quite specifically about these different types of drivers and applying the right solutions to the right problems.
Mm. We also know that children are hugely impressionable. I mean, of course they are. That's how you learn, is by absorbing what's around you and doing what adults tell you. But one of the impressions that we've given them is that if you're feeling anxious or depressed or having a bad day, then that's a reason not to turn up, not to engage. And I spoke to a primary school teacher while I was an MP, who was telling me how the 7 and 8-year-olds in her class, many of them were struggling to get through the day without having some sort of emotional crisis. And she said to me, I just don't understand it, because at the beginning of the day, we spend half an hour filling in our feelings journals. And I thought, well, I'm not surprised they're becoming emotionally unstable if you're asking a 7-year-old to spend half an hour being introspective at the start of the day. 7-year-olds are not supposed to be introspective. Do you think that schools are actually causing these crises more than helping it?
I mean, this is the irony, I think, in it all, and the academic evidence is increasingly coming out now that kind of generalized mental health awareness activities in school are forcing young people to ruminate on perceived problems and to think endlessly about the challenges that they face, rather than inspiring and showing that, with grit and determination, you can overcome these kinds of challenges in life, and that they're normal. It's normal to feel down and gloomy at times, and actually a big part of life is about pushing through that. And I'd add to that I think there's been a huge breakdown in the link between the benefits of work. We hear more and more about kind of mental health days, bed days that some employers are sort of promoting. And again, the irony here is that going into work, interacting with other people, even doing your commute, I know it sounds awful and I hate my commute, but the physical benefits of work also translate into the mental health benefits. So it feels like we are due a big swinging of the pendulum in the other direction on this, where the taboo of talking about mental health will be identified as a problem. We're talking about it far too much rather than all the benefits of other things that keep us fit and mentally well in life.
Now, you mentioned the impact of family breakdown. I mean, certainly that does seem to be one of the biggest causes of educational underachievement, and so it would make sense that it also affects absence. You've also mentioned screen time, and there's some very clear evidence now why social media does make particularly girls feel very anxious, lots of comparison, being notified all the time. Of course, lots of emphasis on what you look like and how you're supposed to be seen. But do you think there's another aspect as well, which is that screens are very addictive, they're very stimulating. Once a child is used to watching 10-second TikTok videos, maths lessons seem pretty dull, don't they?
Yeah, I think, there is, it does seem like there's growing evidence around the kind of attention span decay from early use of some of these apps that provide algorithmic kind of content in a very short form format. And I mean, it's difficult to sort of come at this without feeling a kind of pang of hypocrisy, where we talk about this as a young people issue. We're all addicted to our phones. You look around and uh, you know, at homes, it's very hard, I think, for parents to feel like they can discipline and educate their children to a sort of non-phone use way of life and pick up a book when they themselves have one eye on their phone as they're watching TV in the evening. This is a cross kind of age issue. Um, but it does feel like, we're seeing this in other countries. Greater steps, more radical steps are needed to break the reliance on this kind of technology and this sort of social media at a very young age, certainly.
So it's imperative that we solve this absence crisis and reduce the number of kids persistently not going to school and therefore at risk of long-term unemployment and benefits dependency. So Joe, what are the answers? What is the CSJ proposing that the government, that schools, that parents should do?
So I think there's two sort of sides to this. The first is about crisis response. We need to do things quickly. We need to do them now. So there is very good evidence that when rolled out effectively, a model known as attendance mentors are able to work really closely and intensively with the families grappling with the most severe forms of absence. So this is pupils missing more than half of school time. They get really close to the families. They understand what are the barriers, what are the challenges. Is it about bullying? Is it about mental health condition, and work with them to produce that route back to school. We need to see these mentors rolled out across the country. The government have made a good start on this, but they're only set to reach 3% of all severely absent pupils. So we've got to go further. At the same time, we need to address this issue of softening parental attitudes. I think we do need to look again at, are fines working adequately? How can we increase the awareness among parents about harms of absence? Some of the things I've mentioned about earnings, about long-term prospects. We know that awareness has decayed over the last few years, so we've got to tackle that. But then beyond that, we need to get to the root causes of this. And it speaks to some of the things we touched on earlier about making school a more engaging, more attractive place for young people, looking at things like sports, extracurricular activities that we see in the independent school sector, but less so in the state sector. And I would just say, finally, we can't ignore the home environment. So many kids are turning up to school not ready to learn because of things happening at the home. And so we've got to work much more intensively to help families provide the best start in life for their kids.
And what do you think the government can particularly do about that? I had Bridget Phillipson on at GBNews a few months ago. She was actually talking about the mental health crisis and talking about how the government was going to roll out more counsellors in school. And I made that point that actually family breakdown was driving so much of this problem. Family breakdown is not inevitable. We have far more of it here than in many comparable countries. But her answer really was that it was none of the government's business. Do you share that view?
Well, I think that it's easy to say that, but at the same time, it is already the government's business in that the tax system, for example, is set up in a way that is entirely predisposed to looking at individuals rather than families. That is not the norm necessarily, looking at a whole host of other countries, whether it's the US, Germany or France, and indeed others. It's taken a position on family already just in the way the tax system is set up. So I think we can look at this in the round through the tax system, through the welfare system, and indeed through interventions locally, things like family hubs, for example, where we know that they provide a huge amount of support, particularly the parents who are struggling at a young age with young children, getting them the help they need to get that best start in life. We've got to, again, see those family hubs rolled out much more widely than they are already.
As a parent, top tip for getting a child to school who doesn't want to go? We've all been there.
I think it's about really focusing on the individual case of what's happening with your child. It's really hard to speak in generalities on this because every child is wonderful and different and need different amounts of support and encouragement. But as a country, we've got to do more to tackle this crisis for the future of our economy and for the future of our young people.
Joe Shalam, Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for watching GB News Originals. You can subscribe to our channel in the link below.